Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Inspector General, for taking the time with us today. I have several questions, but perhaps we'll save some of them for the next round. The issue that you addressed at the beginning about strengthening public confidence in our agencies at really all levels of law enforcement, but obviously in this domain with what you have purview over. Um, from an accountability, I think that goes both ways, not only in terms of law enforcement conduct and not abusing their power, not abusing uh, suspects during the custodial phases, but also making sure that we're holding folks who are committing crimes accountable. There's a perception that I hear very frequently, not only in my district here in Southern California, but also throughout the West Coast and in DC, that folks are frankly flabbergasted that we can have major cities in our country be overcome by rioters for extended periods of time without really seeing, in their opinion, and the perception is enough law enforcement coming in to actually stop this type of civil unrest, riots, looting, and arson. We see examples in Portland where it's been now 9 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days of not just peaceful protests, but also looting and vandalism to small businesses over an extended period of time. We see in cities like Seattle, where we have 6 city blocks worth of territory being overtaken by rioters and creating these autonomous zones. There seems to be an unanswered question as to how that can happen for such a long period of time without seeing either the federal government get involved to the point where we're squashing this type of behavior, still allowing for peaceful protests, but not allowing the vandalism and the tens of millions of dollars that we've incurred as a result of the civil unrest, the riots, the looting, and the arson. In your opinion, are we doing enough at the federal government level within the DOJ and all the equities below that to ensure that we are earning the trust of our constituents and the public in terms of just law enforcement in these regards?
Well, thank you, Congressman. And that is an issue that we're looking at both in connection with the events last summer as well as the events at the Capitol, the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, is trying to understand those events from the DOJ perspective. And by the way, we are coordinating with our counterparts at the Interior OIG, which has authority over the Park Police, DHS OIG, which obviously has authority over Secret Service and other law enforcement, and the Department of Defense IG, which has obviously the National Guard. So we are looking to do we are looking at it from the DOJ perspective and coordinating with our counterparts across the IG community. Having said that, obviously, first and foremost, the responsibilities at the local level and the federal government needs to be there to support and work collaboratively with local law enforcement and not come in and, as a general matter, unless you're protecting a federal courthouse or Congress or other locations like that, to usurp local law enforcement. There are questions that have been raised. I'll speak to DOJ specifically with regard to some of the events last year, which is how well prepared are DOJ law enforcement personnel to serve in what are traditionally local law enforcement responsibilities in dealing with civil unrest, issues at the Capitol, things like that. And that is also one of the issues we're looking at. It's not clear to us what kind of training, for example, BOP officers got before they were put in place. FBI officers were put in place. And so that's another question we're looking at.
And is there an opportunity or benefit to look at potential venues to help shape decision making, at least, or inform decision making at the lower city levels, county levels, in the interest of preventing these what start as smaller protests and smaller episodes of looting and rioting from becoming longer extended periods? I mean, yes, it's a local issue, but over time these start influencing other cities throughout our nation, and it becomes a federal problem really quick, right?
Yeah, and this is where just the joint task forces are so critical. at the local level. And that's something we've been looking at from the standpoint of FBI, which has task forces and obviously runs the Joint Terrorism Task Forces across the country, working with DHS. The DEA has many task forces, as does ATF, for the respectively drugs and gun issues and violent crime issues. And one of the things I'll just mention we're looking at is we have an audit that will be out soon on body-worn cameras. And I mention that, even though it isn't perhaps obvious to people, what's the connection between body-worn cameras and the relationship of federal law enforcement to local law enforcement? There's a direct line now, because as we all know, most large cities, most large police forces use body-worn cameras. Federal law enforcement does not. That has led to local law enforcement questioning participation in task forces, because in some instances, it's local law actually that requires the body-worn cameras. And so it's very important for the federal law enforcement community to address that issue and to make sure it is working closely with their counterparts to deal with some of the challenges like body-worn cameras that can come up that you might not think about in the first instance, but when you see this over and over again over the last several years, it's really quite critical to address, and something that I think this committee and other committees will need to think about, because one of the things we're hearing about as we're talking about this issue at the department is the resource issue and the cost issue, which as you know, you funded at the state and local level through the department's Office of Justice Programs. They have given out over $100 million to support that, but it isn't happening at the federal level.